So we'll finish food, fluid, and flesh today. Next week, we're going to look at how that sort of leads into morality, the laws about sexual ethics in particular, but there's even a little more to it than that. That'll be Leviticus chapter 18, 19, and 20. And then the week of the 24th is going to be, it'll be the last Sunday that we are here, and we're going to do the feasts and the festivals of Israel. Now, what that means is that we're not going to get to every part of Leviticus, because if you read through, you'll see that there are certain things that we haven't covered. And unfortunately, that's just the way it goes sometimes. But the feasts and festivals are, I think, really, particularly in light of like New Testament stuff, the feasts and festivals are really, I just think it's fascinating stuff. So I want to cover it. Not that the other stuff isn't fascinating. Don't get me wrong. I think it's all really good, but these I'm particularly drawn to. So that'll take us to the end of this year. Next year, we start a whole new class. And when I was talking to the Faith Formation Committee, I said, I want to do a class on shame. And they're sort of like, maybe you should retitle it or give it a different name or something, because that's, it's been a topic that I've been doing some reading in, and it's something I'm kind of curious. Actually, maybe it's selfish motives, but I want to learn more about it, that dynamic of shame, and how does that play into our own experiences. Because I think it's one of these, it's a piece of, the human condition that is, the fallen human condition that is pretty central to how sin affects us. And so what I want to do is dig a little more into that, but I want to do it, my approach is going to be a little different. It'll be part teaching. I'll do like maybe 20 minutes of sort of me teaching, and then I'll shut the camera off, and then we'll just do dialogue and discussion, because I'm actually curious to learn from you, not your deepest, darkest shame, but just more your reaction and engagement with the topic. So anyway, so that's kind of where we're going to go. But for now, we're going to focus on, well, we already did food, so it'll be fluids and flesh, which, for a Sunday morning, that's something to get you all woke up. And we're going to start with Mark chapter 5. And I'm going to read a story that I think is sort of, it's one of these cornerstone passages that helps us see the purpose of some of these Levitical laws concerning, particularly concerning like blood loss. And I think you can't really understand Leviticus until you really hear this story. So this is Mark chapter 5, and I'm going to pick it up in verse 21. It's kind of a long story, and you've heard it before, I'm sure, but it's worth hearing again in its entirety. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he, Jairus, fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in on the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said of him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who had said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But He put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and he went into where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said, Talitha cumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and he told them to give them something to eat. I'm not going to say a whole lot more about that right now, but just put that story in your mind. We're going to come back to it in a couple minutes and try to unpack it in light of Levitical law. But before we do that, let's turn to God in prayer. Father, we thank you for the way that your word gives to us what are words of life, words of renewal, and ultimately words and hope and the power of resurrection. And even as we look at these laws that pertain to something that seems quite disconnected maybe from our own experience, we see that they ultimately point us to the hope that Jesus gives us. And so even as we consider them this morning, as we study them together, we would ask that your Spirit would be our guide and our teacher. We ask and pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, I think I maybe have shown you the picture there on the right before. If not, you're seeing it now. It's a picture I took in Indonesia about 6 or 7 years ago when I was there. We were visiting a Hindu temple, and right outside there was a sign it's in 4 different languages, and it says, attention please, it is strictly forbidden for the entering of the temple. During the menstruation, it is strictly forbidden the entering of the temple. Thank you. And I put that up there maybe just to point out that the laws, Israelite laws, Jewish laws, were not unique to the Jewish people. In other words, there are other cultures, other religions where there were prohibitions against, or maybe not prohibitions, that's maybe not the best word, but there are laws concerning blood loss, menstruation, particularly as it related to religious experiences, going to the temple. Now the question is, why these laws? Why are they in place? What do they signify? What are they meant to teach? The short answer to that is we don't exactly know. So we can all go home now and be done, because the true answer is the text doesn't exactly give the rationale for this, but it does say in all of chapter 12, it talks about laws that pertain to menstruation and what the laws were concerning that, but also laws concerning childbirth and what would happen when a woman would give birth to a child. She would be considered ritually unclean and impure. So all of chapter 12 kind of spells that out. If you go a little bit later into chapter, I think it's 17. I should probably verify that. I was reading it just again this morning, but of course I always forget which chapter number. But there's a whole other section then that also deals with laws concerning a man's emission of semen. And so that has to do with having sex. When a man and woman would have sex, what effect did that have on their relationship, cleanness, uncleanness? And it turns out that in either case, whether it was a loss of blood or it was an emission of semen, then either the man or the woman would be considered unclean. Now, we've said this a few times before, but it's probably worth repeating. When we hear unclean, I think sort of our default setting is to assume immoral, right? We sort of assume they've done something wrong and therefore they are to be ostracized. And it's really important to remember that that's not the case. Uncleanness is different from immoral. Does that make sense? You kind of see the distinction there. Now, there's sometimes some overlap. In other words, immoral things would make a person unclean. You might, if you want to do one of those Venn diagrams or those, fancy logic things, it's like all uncleanness or all ritual impurity is unclean. How would you do that? It would be all immoral behavior would be unclean, but not all unclean behavior is immoral. Do you see that, or did I just throw your minds into more of a pretzel? But you get the idea there. The important thing is to remember that ritual impurity does not automatically signify that a person has violated a command of God and is therefore immoral. What it does mean, and what it does have an effect on, is how close you can get to the temple and to the presence of God. And any loss of blood, and any loss of any emission of semen, whether it be nocturnal emission or whether it be through sexual intercourse, would mean that a person would be unclean, and it would mean that any person who came into contact with a surface that had been touched by either a man or a woman who was unclean would also mean that they were unclean. And furthermore, in the case of a woman giving birth, that woman would be unclean for a segment of time, and that segment of time would vary whether or not the woman had given birth to a boy or to a girl. Now here's where it's sort of like our culture says, well, that's not fair, right? That seems very sexist. And here's also where I have to say we have no idea why. The text does not specify, but it's a woman was considered unclean for 33 days if it was a boy, 66 days if it was a girl, so twice as long. No idea why. No idea why the difference. Now, there's some theories as to why would the woman be considered unclean for a whole month. One of the answers is that, well, possibly it had to do with the fact that this was a time of recovery for the woman after giving birth. And during this time, the woman would be separated from community, not ostracized. I mean, she could be around her family and that, but generally speaking, she'd be sort of more, protected from people just, engaging with all the normal activities of day-to-day life, which maybe was a good thing for the woman's health and recuperation after childbirth. As to why it's different for a boy versus a girl, nobody really knows. That I've found. Maybe there's a theory floating around that I haven't heard yet, but most of it, when I looked at the commentaries on this, they basically just came back and said, we don't really know why. The impurity would take place in stages, and so for a boy it would be, for the first 7 days, okay, she's impure, and then she'd have to have the boy circumcised, and then she's impure for another 33 days after that. And then during that time, then there are certain things prescribed like washing, and then bringing offerings and sacrifices, and then at the end of that 33-day period, so it would actually be 41 days. If you include the 8 days, then circumcision, then 33 more, then an offering. Then she was clean and pure again, and then her time of uncleanness was over. And if it's a girl, it's 66 days from the time of birth until the offering is brought at the end of that period of time, and then she reintegrates back into society. So again, no sense of why it's different. It was specified that it would be different there for boys versus girls. And then it was kind of like I said, it's a process of reintegration that includes purification, washing, offering sacrifices, and then they'd be considered clean again. Any questions on that?
Maybe it's just a little too simple, but it strikes me that you have 2 females, so therefore the time frame makes sense to be doubled because the potential for that loss of blood is doubled.
Could be.
Granted, it's an infant and she's not going to menstruate yet, but I can
Could be.
see the potential for that.
Yeah, it's a possibility, right? It's kind of I think this is a good example of one of these places in Scripture where we can speculate, and it's kind of interesting to sort of think through. As one of my New Testament professors said a long time ago, is wherever the Bible whispers, we whisper, and where it shouts, we shout. So I think as long as we whisper that, I think it's a good theory to consider. Certainly as a possibility. Other questions or comments? Yeah, Melissa.
Did she go to the temple for circumcision? And was circumcision held in the?
Yeah, I believe so. Let me see if I can quick look that up. Yeah, after 7 days at the time of menstruation, she's unclean. On the 8th day, his foreskin shall be circumcised, then she shall continue for 33 days. It doesn't actually say that she'd go to the temple. So perhaps, yeah, I don't know. I hesitate again. I don't want to shout where I don't hear shouting, but it's possible that father brings the child, and then that would allow the woman to remain separate and still in her state of ritual impurity, but the child is circumcised. That's a possibility, yeah. But because it doesn't say that they bring it to the temple, although we see in the New Testament that's what seems to happen, right? They bring Jesus to the temple and others as well.
Did it indicate if Mary was present?
I don't think so.
Mary and Joseph were both present.
Yeah. I don't remember. Now you're asking good questions. You're making me do my homework here on the spot.
I'm wondering if the double time has to do with the child, because it seems like that circumcision, like the 33 days happens after the circumcision. Mm-hmm. If say like 33 days is like your standard, you're clean after 33 days, but in a male child, they have this way to expedite that because of circumcision. And so the 33 days doesn't start until the child is ritually clean.
Right,
And then the mother, so for the
Yeah.
girl child, it's 33 and then 33.
yeah,
But
that could
for a
be,
male
that could
child,
be,
you have that sort of fast track.
yeah, that very well could be, yeah. So, good, see, you have good thoughts on this.
It says in,
What'd you come up with? Yeah,
that Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord.
yeah, so
She was clearly on the journey.
she was on the journey, but then the question is, how far into the precinct of the temple would she be able to go?
But would she have been allowed to go on the journey if she was
Yeah.
considered ritually unclean? Because you would have been, it's not like it was
Yeah,
just down
it's
the road.
right.
You're
Yeah,
staying
you have to
somewhere
travel
along the way
and-
you have to
yeah.
travel.
That though in Luke is after, is separated from, it's not circumcision.
Okay.
On the eighth
Ah,
day, when it was
okay.
time to circumcise him, he was named Jesus.
Yeah, so it doesn't tell us, right, that,
When the time came, when the time of the
Okay.
purification, everybody the law of Moses had been completed, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem.
okay, so that right there, that's clarity. So they bring him to the temple to present him after her time of ritual impurity, but the circumcision would have been still on the 8th day then, as prescribed. And that doesn't say whether Mary was there, so,
Would it be
Yeah.
possible that they would go to him to circumcise him?
You know, I don't know. My inclination is to say that would have been done in the temple, but I could be wrong on that. I know that in, like in modern times, comes to you, goes to your house or your apartment or whatever, and they circumcise it in home, but that's because there is no temple any longer. So,
Just
yeah.
the logistics even of traveling even currently with the medical
Yeah.
knowledge that we have with an infant to get them there by 8 days would be
Yeah.
hard for a mother that just gave birth.
Right.
And that baby that has no food source other than that mother couldn't be
I would think,
separated.
right, yeah, it's not like they could
So-
put the baby on formula for a few days.
Right.
Yeah, good question. I don't know, you're asking thoughtful questions and I don't know the answer to all that, but interesting thoughts. Any other questions or theories? So, one of the things that I think is important to remember is that ritual impurity could be spread. So in other words, if I'm ritually unclean, and this goes for any reason, if I have a skin illness or impurity of any other kind, and I come and I, pat Larry on the back, now Larry's unclean. It's sort of like the cooties when you're in the 3rd grade. You remember how it's like you don't want to touch the kid with cooties, and well, okay, ritual impurity is not cooties. Let's be clear about that. But the idea is there that impurity would spread. And it could spread on, if you're seated on a chair or on a bed or something. So maybe I've shared this before, but even today in Jewish communities, at least in Orthodox Jewish communities, when a woman is on her monthly period, they sleep in separate beds to observe this law. And I think I told you as well that men and women, or husband and wife, don't actually have physical contact during that time of any kind. They don't, so if husband wants to pass his wife an object, he will set it down and then she will pick it up so as to avoid the ritual impurity. So, and that's because it can be spread. Now, the reason I bring that up is because if you come into Mark chapter 5, this is the story. This is why I read that story at the beginning, because Mark chapter 5, I think, tells us how Jesus deals with that. Mark 5 is it's a fascinating story. Oh, let me put the. Oh, here we go. On the one hand, you look at this and you think Jesus has his priorities all wrong, right? Here's a little girl who, like, if you call 911, this is like get the ambulance there, code 3, because this little girl is dying. And then as Jesus is making his way over there, it's like they stop the ambulance and there's this woman who's been sick for, how many years has she been sick? Was it say 12 years, right? So, okay, that when you prioritize, like if you listen to 911 dispatchers, they prioritize a woman who's been sick for 12 years, like the ambulance will still go to her house, but they're going to go like code 2, which means they're not going to have lights and sirens on. They're not going to race to the house because 12 years has been happening. Probably nothing urgent is going to change in the next 20 minutes. But yet Jesus, as Jesus is going along, this woman comes up to Jesus and touches him, and Jesus stops just like that, and which is such a strange thing to do when you've got a life or death case still a little ways away. But then there's this engagement that's kind of strange, right? Because what the woman does, the woman reaches out and touches his cloak, but what's really important is where on Jesus' cloak she actually takes hold of. Our text doesn't really spell it out for us. It just says the hem of his garment or the edge of his cloak or something like that. What really they're referring to is something called I always say it quite wrong, but it's the tzitzis. I want to say it like the Greek sauce that you put in a falafel, right? Tzatziki sauce, really good stuff, but that's not what it is. It's the fringe of his garment that represented the law. And so what this woman was really doing was she was taking hold of that because in a sense she understood that her righteousness, the righteousness of Jesus was there, and if she could take hold of that, she would be healed. So this is not magic that the woman, it's not like she believes that Jesus is like, supercharged with power, and if she just sort of touches it's like zzz. It's not that. It's if I claim his righteousness, then I will be healed. That's essentially what she's doing. And sure enough, that's what happens. Now what's striking is that normally, when an unclean woman touches a clean person, what happens? The uncleanness spreads to the clean, right? So it's kind of like this flow that goes from one direction to the next. But in this case, how does it go? Jesus' cleanness and his purity goes from the clean person to the unclean person and makes the unclean person clean. So what Jesus is doing is he's reversing the flow of purity. He's changing directions. It's like the only time in the Bible that happens, because normally it always goes the other direction. Now, what Mark does in telling this story is he's tying these two stories together. So he puts the story about the woman in the middle, and then the story about Jairus and his daughter on both ends of it. So it's what we sometimes call a Markan sandwich. So I can maybe sketch it out because I like to draw things that, but you get Jairus and his dying daughter. And then you get woman who's unclean, but she's made clean by Jesus, right? So Jesus, I'm running out of room, so we'll just do JC. She's made clean by Jesus. So the purity moves from Jesus to the woman and makes her clean. Well, then we come back to Jairus and his daughter. And what happens with Jairus' daughter? Well, she's died at this point, but Jesus comes in and what happens? What does he do?
Reverses.
He reverses it, but he touches her, right? And so his cleanness once again moves to the person who's died, to the little girl who's died. Now, why is that important? Because the ultimate example of uncleanness is what? It's death. And so in this case, Jesus reverses the greatest uncleanness by giving his life to her. And the way that Mark writes this out is he wants us to interpret this story in light of this story. So how do you reverse the curse? How do you reverse uncleanness? Well, it's by taking hold of the righteousness of Jesus, right? So just as this woman grabs onto the righteousness of Jesus and is made clean, how is the curse of death reversed? By taking hold of the righteousness of Jesus. Do you see that? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, and of course, how that, the full story here isn't written, because how does Jesus reverse the curse of death? Well, death goes to him. So there's this exchange that takes place. Do you see that? So just as the uncleanness of the woman is put upon Jesus, so also the uncleanness, the ultimate uncleanness of death is put on Jesus, and Jesus would go to the cross. He would go to the ultimate experience of death and decay. He would experience that in its fullness so that his life could then be given to us through his righteousness. Do you see how that all kind of fits together? It's kind of like you have to bring these different ideas together. Does that make sense? Or you have questions or comments on that? Or it makes so much sense no questions, or you're totally baffled and you don't know where to start. But just a little side note on that, that's why what I think, when you think of the laws of purity and impurity, that's why I think the reason those laws are in place is because they were teaching that the loss of blood or the loss of semen was, in a sense, the loss of something life-giving. in a symbolic way. And so then when you get into the New Testament, what Jesus is doing is he's really showing that he's the one who gives us the life. He's the one who gives us true life. So that this is all of the Leviticus stuff is like a scale model for this. It's a picture that points us to where our true purity comes from. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Pushback, thoughts, reflections?
I think that's really beautiful truth to think about. The very opposite, that the purity of Jesus flowing to the unclean.
Right. Right. I love that. When I first heard it, it was like, wow, that, because you never quite understood why does Jesus, stop the ambulance for this woman who he could have circled back and, but he doesn't. He stops to have this conversation, and then it all kind of is like, you see what he's doing there. This story is meant to help us see the bigger story.
I never realized that, I never understood how it was sandwiched or why it was in there, and
Right.
I can see death being done.
Right. There are a couple other places where that happens. If you, especially in Mark's gospel, sometimes you hear them called Markan sandwiches. Sounds like something you'd buy at a deli, right? But in actuality, a couple times you'll find a story, then a story, and then you're back to the first story. And anytime you do that, just keep in mind that the story in the middle is meant to help you understand the other story on both sides of it. It's kind of a hermeneutical technique. Question or comment? Yeah, Jessica.
So the hem of the garment,
Mhm.
I always, when I read that, assumed it was like the bottom hem of the tunic, closest to the ground, that she would have kind of snuck in that way. Would it be more realistic that it was like the hem of the sleeve or something along those lines?
I'm not positive, but I thought it was the hem of the sleeve. Yeah, do you know, Linda?
I think it's his prayer shawl.
Oh, his prayer shawl?
The-
Yeah, that could be.
the-
That could be.
That's where the teats
Okay.
are.
Yeah, okay, that's good. I'd have to, yeah, right. So my Jewish friend would, yeah, but that makes sense. That makes sense, yeah. So, other questions? All right, let's talk about flesh. Sorry for the nice graphic picture up there. I just Googled leprosy and that's what I got. And so, again, it's kind of gross, but, and I touched on this a few weeks ago in the worship service. Of course, in Leviticus, the word is translated in the NIV anyways as leprosy. Today, what we call leprosy is actually a specific illness called Hansen's disease. The symptoms of Hansen's disease are very different than all the things that you read in Leviticus. Leviticus, when you read the word leprosy, and anywhere in the New Testament as well, refers usually just to, it's kind of a broad range of any kind of skin condition. So anything that you'd see a dermatologist for, Old Testament times probably would have been categorized, at least possibly, as leprosy. And it includes everything from, a rash to sort of a weeping wound to a burn, to, not to single up too many of you out, but baldness as well would fall under this category. So I'm not gonna look at any one person here. I saw a picture of myself a couple weeks ago and realized I'm starting to thin out a little bit, so we're all in this together. But there were regulations that had to do with if you are losing your hair, and then you'd have to be examined by a priest. Now, all of chapters, I think it's 13 and 14, deal with leprosy and mold and mildew in the home. Now the reason, that seems totally unrelated, but the reason for it is that mold and mildew in the home was sort of like leprosy of your home, for lack of a better term. So if you got something that's growing and spreading where it doesn't belong, then it all falls under that category. And so that's why it all is included there. Most of what you find in chapter 13 is sort of like, it's almost like a medical textbook where it says, if this is the condition and these are the symptoms, then this is what it is and this is what to do about it. And it just keeps going on and on like that. And it lays out a whole bunch of different possible symptoms, including, what color is the hair in the wound? What color is the wound itself? How deep does the hair go? Is it white? Is it yellow? Is it red? And so it's kind of like, it's kind of gross. You have to be not super squeamish if you want to really read through it all. I think I put that in the bulletin a few weeks ago. I put that little, if you were to do a napkin drawing, I don't know if you remember seeing that. I tried to print it out and then I had trouble printing it. But essentially, and I forgot to put it up there, but essentially it gives a taxonomy of what a priest would do. So the way it would work is if let's say you wake up in the morning and you see that there's some kind of a wound or a sore or a rash on your hand or your arm, You might watch it for a day or two to see if it sticks around or if it disappears the next day, you might be okay. But after, you wouldn't wait very long and you kind of keep an eye on it. And if it sticks around and it's, you've got it, and especially if it's growing or it's spreading, then you would go and you make an appointment not to see your doctor, but you go and see the priest. By the way, please don't come and visit me with your sores and wounds. I don't really want to see them. But you would go and the priest would take a look at that and he would make a determination, is this leprosy? In other words, is this a growing or a spreading skin condition? And then there would be a certain criteria. If right away he could identify it as something that was, leprous, then you'd be put in quarantine. You'd be isolated. You'd be considered unclean, and you'd be removed from the community until it cleared up, or sometimes you'd be there your whole life if it's if it's like a chronic condition. Now, just a quick word about that. Not to make it sound like it was Club Med or something like that, but so there's a community outside the gates or the walls of Israel, or outside the camp of Israel, and that would be where the leprous people live. Now, it was a community of its own, so it's not like you're just wandering through the wilderness all by yourself. Your family could come and visit you, so you could actually it's not that you'd lose all contact with your family members, but they would have to just make sure that they follow the proper purification rules before re-entering into the camp. So it was difficult and it was ostracizing and all of that, but it's not like, you'd have to say goodbye to your wife or your husband and never see them again. It's just they have to move and live here, and now you've got to visit them maybe once a week or however you did that, and then follow purification rules to re-enter the camp. So that's what happens if you are determined to have leprosy. But if the priest looks at it and says, well, I'm not too sure, that could be something, it maybe is not. What you do is you'd be put in quarantine for 7 days. And then the priest would come back after 7 days and sort of re-examine, and they would want to look for, is it spreading or is it healing? If it's, if at the end of 7 days they look at it, the priest looks at it and says, well, it's not spreading, but it's still there, and so we're not quite sure. You'd be waiting another 7 days, and then at the end of that 14 days, then the priest would make a final determination, and the criteria would be, is it spreading? That would be the number one thing. If it continues to spread, then it's something to be concerned of. And if it's not spreading, even if at the end of 14 days, the priest would look at it and say, well, it's still there, but it's not spreading. You'd be able to then re-enter the camp, provided that you follow the purification, and then you could go back. And the priest would just determine that it's probably a fairly harmless skin condition, and it's not a permanent thing. It's not something that you need to be excluded for permanently. Oops, I find a spelling mistake there. It says nad, it should see and. But anyways, you kind of get the way that the skin criteria worked. It was all of 13 and 14 are like that. And then it talks about how do you cleanse it. So chapter 14 gets into how do you, what are the rules concerning the offerings that you'd have to bring? How do you, once you're ready to re-enter, what are the steps that you take for that? Any questions on just the overview here of skin laws? Yeah, great.
I was trying to Google up to remember if it was Elijah or Elisha, his servant. I remember when that guy dipped 7 times.
Yeah.
And then he became up. That sounded like there's a lot more bad stuff than just ceremonial, I think.
Right. So some of these skin conditions would be really serious. They would be, potentially, again, it's hard to know, and especially if I'm not a doctor, I don't know exactly what it could be, but some of these skin conditions could be, I think, pretty severe and potentially life-threatening and infectious. And so that's why I think part of what these rules, and I think the case that you're mentioning is one of those examples when it's Elisha's servant, because he's sort of dishonest about the money. He comes back and says, well, actually my master changed his mind and wants some of the money. And okay, well, all right, a little tacky, but here you go. And it turns out he was being dishonest, and so he's struck with again, the word is leprosy, but we don't know exactly what was the illness, but it was something that would have then excluded him probably permanently, and it would have been potentially, life-threatening, or it would have, been a terminal illness of some kind, but what, we don't know. But that does also kind of help us see that possibly, again, it's not definitive, but possibly one of the reasons for these rules was to preserve the health of the community. In other words, if you get lots of people living in close quarters, you don't have good modern medicine the way we do today, and so disease would spread much more readily. You want a mechanism for containing that, and so that's some of the rationale. I don't think it's the main thing, but I think it is part of it that is meant to be a health thing for the Jewish community, for the Israelite community, because some of these illnesses indeed could be life-threatening and even fatal in the long term. So, yeah. Other questions? So then, what lessons learned? Well, one of the things, and I have this. So first of all, this kind of is all with food, fluid, and flesh. This is sort of big picture. First of all, ritual purity is not moral purity. I think I said that already before. I'm not going to say too much more about it right now, but just keep that in mind. Ritual purity has to do with how do you get near to the presence of God. Moral purity has to do with your relationship to the law of God. Have you broken God's law, or have you stayed within the boundaries of God's law? So those are two different things, although at times there is overlap. So keep that in mind. Anytime you're reading in the book of Leviticus and it talks about people being impure or unclean, keep in mind that that's not necessarily a verdict on their moral conduct, okay? Because again, people hear that and they, why is a woman unclean after she gives birth to a girl, and why is she, or after she gives birth at all? Like, what did she do wrong? Why is that wrong? And the answer is it's not wrong. And by the same token, why are they unclean if a man and a husband and wife have sex? Why are they unclean? Like, that seems, and it's like they're not immoral. That's perfectly within the design of God for his people, but impurity is not immorality, right? So keep that always in mind. That said, ritual purity points us to moral purity. So all through chapters 13, 14, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, it deals with ritual purity. And then what you find in chapters like 17 through 19, it begins to transition into what we'll talk about next week, which is moral purity. And what you'll find is that some of the language is the same. And so, when it talks about those who do X, Y, or Z, they are impure, or it is an abomination. So it'll use that same language, and it's the same language that's used when it talks about violating ritual purity. Does that make sense? So, but I think what that's trying to do is it's trying to help us see that ritual purity and our sense of how do you get close to the presence of God in a ritual sense, there's something to learn there, but it's actually pointing us to the consequences of moral behavior, so that when we look at ritual purity, we begin to understand it, and it prepares us to understand the implications of moral purity. So even though ritual impurity and moral impurity are separate, ritual impurity gives us a pattern to understand moral impurity. Does that make sense? You kind of see how that functions. This is one of these, God says, okay, I'm going to start with something that's comparatively simple, teach you about laws that would separate you from me, but even if it's not an immorality thing, even if it's not about breaking a moral law, but when you understand that, then it'll help you see what does it mean to break moral commandments. So there's a relationship there, but they're not one and the same, and I think that's important to remember. And we'll talk more about that in chapter when we get to chapter 17 through 19 next week. We'll try to make some sense of how are these moral laws laid out. Interestingly, they deal with, there's a lot of moral laws. I mean, sexuality is one of the big ones, but it's not the only one. It also talks about loving your neighbor as yourself. Jesus, by the way, quotes Leviticus when he talks, answers the question, who is my neighbor? Jesus quotes from Leviticus. In other words, he's saying holy living is about loving your neighbor. Now, we'll get more to that next week, but just kind of want to put your mind in that direction. So that's the other thing. That's the second thing. The third thing, when you think of these laws, food, fluid, and flesh, God calls his people to be distinct in the world. Now, distinct doesn't mean isolated, but it means unique. It means different. We're going to see that again. And again, the ritual purity thing prepares us for the moral purity aspect of that, right? Because today, the church is called to be a holy people. We shouldn't look like the people around us who are non-believers. Our conduct should be different. Now, well, probably getting ahead of myself a little bit, probably most of our minds go to one particular area. It might be sexuality, but I think actually for other people, their mind might say, well, Christians should be more passionate about, say, social justice. My point in that is not to open a can of worms, although maybe I just did, but it's to say, when we think about what does it mean to be holy people in this world, it's all encompassing. And we sometimes all have our little hobby horses, but really holy living should set us apart in a lot of different ways in this world that we are living in. Not holy in the sense that we withdraw from the world, but holy in the sense that we are distinct in our conduct. So people around us, people that you work with, people that you go to school with, people that you're, in your friend group, whatever, and maybe more broadly, the culture as a whole should look at the church and say, yeah, there's something different about those Christians. And sometimes the world is going to be really opposed to it, and other times, as Peter writes, they're going to look at it and they're going to give praise to God because they see these Christians are doing things for the poor, or they're doing things for their community that nobody else really wants to do. And that, so that's kind of the idea of holiness and distinctiveness. It's moral conduct, but it should be more than that as well. But we'll say more about that next week. Holiness extends to all of life. This is what Bruce was getting at earlier, and including pest control sorts of things. But in all actuality, holiness is, I think one of the things God is trying to teach his people is that holiness is not something you do at a limited time, say on Sunday morning, as we might say it today. Right now, as you come to church this morning, you worship God. Okay, that's part of holy living, right? It's worship. But sometimes people, okay, well, now it's Monday, it's business. It's just business. Yeah, if you're going to make it in this business, if you're going to make it in this world, you've got to sort of be dog eat dog. And that's, it's not, no hard feelings, it's not personal, it's just business. I can be dishonest, I can cheat, I can, and to that, we'd say, no, holiness extends to all of life, right? So even Paul in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians, he says, whether you eat or drink, do it all to the glory of God. So if you're eating and drinking, should be done in such a way that gives glory to God. What about all the other relatively larger things than just having pizza for dinner or whatever else it might be, right? So all of life falls under the umbrella of holiness. And then of course, and this is what Calvin would say as well, and he would say it about all the law, what is the purpose of the law? What is the purpose of the Torah? What is the purpose of purity law? It does two things, well, there's more, but it does at least two things. One of them is I'll say it in a very Calvinistic way, tongue-in-cheek, but it tells us how bad we are. Okay, not really. It exposes our sin, right? The law exposes the fact, here's what God desires of us. Here's what holiness really looks like, and it encompasses all of your life. Guess what? You're never going to do it. But Calvin would be very quick to say, this is not to lead us to despair. It's to lead us to Jesus. It's to say, if you really want the purity that God is after, you're not going to find it in yourself. And so, little side note, I went to Barnes & Noble Friday night. Barnes & Noble is now open in Salem, which is like really good news for me. Amy and I would go there when we were first married and broke and had not two dimes to rub together, so you could go and read books all night long, and loved it. So, okay, this was walk down nostalgia. But it used to be called the self-help section. Remember that? And you could find books about, whatever, self-improvement. It's not called that anymore. It's called the self-transformation section. Now, I'm sure there's deep spiritual meaning to that. I haven't fully unpacked it yet, but my point is it seems bigger. Like, now this isn't just help. This is like transformation. And from a Christian vantage point, we say the true transformation, we all need help, but the true transformation, the true purity that we need is found in Jesus, right? So that's why Mark chapter 5 is so important. Where is that purity going to be? Where are we going to find it? It's going to be found in Jesus. He is the purity. His righteousness, his garment, the prayer shawl, the righteousness that we need is found by when we in faith, as that woman did, cling to the garment of Jesus, cling to the righteousness of Jesus. He gives us the purity. He gives us the life that we all need. All right, good point to end. Let me close for us in prayer, and then we'll look ahead to next week when we do the moral law. Father, we thank you for Jesus, who is our true purity. He is our true righteousness. He is our true life. Thank you that your word points us really so clearly to this. As we study it, as we reflect on it, we do see Jesus even here in these laws that at first glance seem rather perplexing, but when we go into it, we see the beauty of the gospel, and we thank you for that. Be with us in the rest of our days. We worship together, watch over us, and help us to glorify and honor you in all that we do today and in all of life. In Christ's name, amen.
Thank you, that's all.
My pleasure.